Chapter 24. Leaning against the railing, Emmett stared down at the creek below. A plastic bottle bobbed sadly in the shallows, its journey along the dirty waterway held up by a mossy rock. Going nowhere fast. Emmett sighed. That was precisely how he was starting to feel. Exactly 1 week ago, he'd been seated face to face with Rosemary's frantic brother, the anxious words of Daniel Norman still ringing vividly in his ear. Something bad has happened. Why else would she just vanish? Since then, they'd followed every lead, got the state's best homicide detectives involved, and interviewed countless people. And yet here he was, back where the women's bodies were dumped, no closer to finding out who'd killed Rosemary Norman or Natalie Gibson. He closed his eyes, placing a palm on his chest. Why was his heart beating so quickly? He shook his head. He'd sneaked back home sometime after 3 a.m, hoping to catch up on some sleep. Instead, he'd spent the few hours he had twisting and turning in a pool of sweat. His dreams filled with Rosemary's playful smile, Natalie's soulful eyes, her little children Dario and Aria dancing around him endlessly. And then that man, that unknown figure walking up and down the corridors of the nursing home, like a ghost, haunting him. Emmett stood up, moving away from the pedestrian overpass and following the lonely bike path towards the city. He hadn't intended on stopping by the site today, but he'd been passing directly by it on the way back from speaking with Brian Gibson and Natalie's parents yet again. They hadn't been able to help with the identity of the man in the security footage, but Emmett had found some comfort in the knowledge that the Mancinis had booted Natalie's husband out of the family business. And Brian's returned the money? He'd asked, remembering the heavy duffel bag full of cash.
Yes,
Francesca had scowled.
And he'll be paying us a rent.
A loud whoosh from around the bend signalled a train approaching, and Emmett braced himself for the rush of wind he knew was coming. He watched the carriages rattle past, a blur of faces staring back through the grubby windows. How had no one seen what had happened here? Stopping a little further along, he took several cautious steps down to the muddy creek bed, remembering where the first of the blue tarpaulins had lain. He pictured Rosemary's vacant gaze staring off into the distance, the strands of tangled red hair. You're out there somewhere. Checking the time, he realised he had to keep moving. He wasn't looking forward to his meeting with Bryce Frederick, but he knew the head of homicide wouldn't appreciate being made to wait. Trudging up the embankment, Emmett headed back the way he'd come, following the path under a concrete overpass. Oh, sorry. He had almost collided with a teenage boy on the other side of the path. That was the 11:58, the boy responded oddly, his eyes glued to his mobile phone. Right. Emmett shook his head and hurried on to his car. His boss was expecting a detailed update on where they were at with the investigation. If only he had something meaningful to say. A storm's coming. Bryce Frederick gestured towards his generous office window, where ominous clouds could be seen rolling in from the west. Max is meant to be trialling athletics tonight. Don't think that'll be happening. No. Emmett sipped the espresso he'd picked up on the way in. So, what's forensics said about this jewellery you found? They identified multiple strands of foreign DNA on both the necklace and the bracelet, but none that match anyone on our system. And that photo of the old school friend you mentioned? Daniel Norman can't remember the boy's name, but he's adamant that it's a former friend of Tom's, so I've got Carter and Williams searching through school records for names of former classmates. One theory we're considering is that an old acquaintance saw the newspaper article about Tom and was prompted to go and see him. But whether that's connected to our murders, we don't know. But we're presuming the killer met the women at the nursing home. That seems the most plausible scenario at the moment. And you have footage of a man visiting Tom Norman a number of times? That's right. Emmett did his best to stifle a yawn. The nursing home management weren't able to identify that man, and we haven't been able to match him with anyone in our database. But we're sending the footage nationwide in case he has a record in another state. I see. Bryce rolled his neck, looking decidedly unimpressed. To be fair, the vision isn't great. Emmett floundered. The man's face is entirely covered by a baseball cap. He could be anyone, really. But I'm thinking we'll have to release the vision to the public. Hopefully someone will at least recognize his clothing. It's not particularly distinctive, though. No, Emmett agreed, picturing the thin man in his jeans and hoodie. And you remember what happened with the Timothy Reynolds case in Adelaide? Emmett nodded. The child strangler had gone into hiding after footage of him walking from the shops had been released. 2 years on, there was still no justice for the grieving families. Let's give ourselves another 24 hours before releasing the footage. Bryce waved an imaginary bug away in irritation. With all the resources I've given you, I'm sure you'll be able to flush out another couple of leads by then. The rain had come down hard all afternoon, and flash flooding across the city had left Melbourne's public transport system in a mess. Abby miserably pressed herself into the crowd of soggy commuters huddled under the meagre shelter. Would a tram ever arrive? She jiggled her feet, checking the time. She was dreading the stupid parent-teacher interviews, but worse was the fear of what was to come later that evening. Finally, the man beside her groaned, as the familiar sharp angles of a green tram came trundling around the corner. Abby cringed as she saw the passengers crammed inside. She had to board this tram. She couldn't be late. Just managing to squash herself in, she balanced precariously, unable to reach either of the handrails near the doorway, while attempting to mentally rehearse potential topics that might arise with Spencer's teachers. But all she could think about was Marcus. You're just incredible. Her face flushed as she remembered his words, whispered from somewhere underneath her sheets. They were perfect together. So why was some woman claiming to have his child? Abby frowned. At least now she had a plan. It had been more than luck that she'd stumbled across Marcus's address. It was a sign from the universe. She was sure of it. That's why, immediately after the parent-teacher interviews, she was going to his home in St. Kilda. She would introduce him to her son. It would be difficult, but she would confront him once and for all. No more game playing. No more secrets. Watch out, a woman growled as Abby lost her footing, falling heavily backwards. Sorry, Abby mumbled. At the top of Elizabeth Street, the tram was held up by a confused truck driver who was seemingly unable to navigate the roundabout of death, as the locals referred to it. I'll be fine. Abby checked the time. It won't matter if I'm a few minutes late. They eventually got moving, but the relief was short-lived. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. Due to the severe flooding, we will be terminating this service at the Royal Children's Hospital. a man's voice announced over the tram's inadequate loudspeaker. What? Abby turned to her fellow commuters in disbelief. Replacement buses will be operating every half an hour. We do apologise for the inconvenience. Opening the GPS on her phone, Abby tried calculating how much time the disruption would cost her. The hospital was only a half a dozen blocks from the school. If it wasn't for the rain, she'd probably be better to just get out and walk. Hopefully the replacement bus service will be there. It wasn't. As she surveyed the long line of wet people impatiently waiting for the non-existent bus outside the hospital, Abby wanted to scream. It wasn't fair. All she was trying to do was to be a good mother to her son. Why was it always so hard to do the right thing? Pausing briefly under a shop awning, she tucked her handbag under her arm and took a deep breath. She was just going to have to sprint. There was no other option. When she finally made it to the school hall, she was absolutely saturated. Her shirt soaking and see-through, her hair plastered to her scalp in a lumpy mess. Oh dear, a woman tut-tutted as they passed each other. Wet out, is it? Just a little. Abby forced herself to laugh. Her heart sank as she looked around the near-empty hall. Her son was sitting sadly in the corner. Spencer, she called out, ignoring inquiring glances from the few parents remaining. Are any of your teachers still here? He shrugged, his attention entirely on the paper plane he was attempting to make. Spencer! Abby marched over, her wet feet squeaking noisily. I asked you a question. She grabbed the paper plane from him. Give it back! His high-pitched squeal echoed around the room. I hate you! The inquiring glances turned to blatant stares. Abby wanted to disappear into the floor, but instead she stood up taller. Here I am, everyone. The world's worst parent has arrived. Oh, you made it. The quiet voice of Spencer's sports teacher came from behind. Abby turned around, happy to see at least one teacher still there. She extended a damp hand. Sorry I'm late. The sports teacher smiled, but Abby noticed his eyes drifting to the clock behind her. I'm Owen Peters. I take Spencer for sport. I think we met this morning. He stopped, unable to hide a long yawn. If you'd like to take a seat, we can have a quick chat about your son. I'm afraid I can't stay too late, though. Passing the creased paper plane back to her son, Abby sat down at a table, clicking her wet feet together nervously under her chair. The teacher returned with some notes and a small orange hand towel. Perhaps you'd like to pat yourself down with that. Abby took the towel, awkwardly dabbing at her saturated clothes. As I said, I take Spencer for physical education. The teacher flicked through his notes. So I'm only able to discuss his progress in that area. That's fine. Again, Abby noticed dark shadows under the man's eyes, and she immediately felt guilty for holding him up. Thank you. At your son's age, our sports classes are all about enjoyment and participation. I like my students to develop a sense of fun from physical activity, whatever form that may take. Abby nodded. Unfortunately, Spencer hasn't been able to participate much due to his ongoing health issues and sporadic attendance. The teacher paused, apparently waiting to see if Abby wanted to jump in. She didn't. To be honest, I've been quite disappointed by his lack of involvement in my classes. It has made it hard for him to progress or develop any real skills. I've also noticed he's less inclined to join other children for games at recess or lunchtime. Abby shifted in her seat. He has asthma, she said, sounding utterly stupid. I realise that. The teacher attempted a smile. But many of our students have similar health concerns and are still able to participate. What's his asthma management strategy? Abby balked. Here she was back at school, about to fail yet another test. He has medication, she said, hopping up to retrieve her son's backpack and returning with 2 small inhalers. He has to take these every day. Owen looked at the blue and brown tubes, his expression bemused. I'm aware of standard asthma medication, he said, but does Spencer have an asthma action plan? I'm not really sure. You're not sure? The doctor didn't tell me. Owen sighed and rubbed his forehead. He was clearly regretting wasting his time with her. Abby's eyes began to well up. She was so sick of people making her feel stupid. I'm doing my best, she blurted, a little too loudly. On the far side of the hall, a tall woman turned, her eyebrows raised questioningly. I'm not here to judge you. The teacher lowered his voice, reaching behind him for a box of tissues, apparently aware of the torrent of tears that was threatening to break forth. I'm just trying to understand the situation, so we can best support your son. The gentle words were too much, and as Abby scrunched a tissue uselessly in her left palm, she lost all composure. I've had a terrible day, she stammered. And Spencer's not really my son. Well, he is, but he doesn't know it. The teacher frowned. He's been living with my mother, you see, but she got angry after I forgot to take him to the school production, so then she turned up and left him on my porch. It's been really difficult on me because I'm trying to get this great job at a finance company, and I've met this guy, but he doesn't know I have a child. Unable to stop the stream of words flooding out of her mouth, Abby shared far more than she'd intended. The pain of the teenage pregnancy, the guilt at missing so many of Spencer's milestones, her multiple attempts to have some kind of relationship with him, her fear that his illness was in some way her doing, and her inability to follow through with even the smallest of promises. I'm just constantly letting him down, she sobbed. The teacher pushed the box of tissues closer. It sounds like you've both been through a lot. We have. Abby wiped under her eyes, where ruined mascara was pooling. And it never seems to get any better. I'd like to discuss this further with you. Perhaps we could schedule a time for later this week? Abby nodded. But for now, I really must be getting home. Why don't I walk you out? In the corner of the room, Spencer had slumped against the wall. Abby's back strained as she reached down and picked him up. Where are you parked? The teacher asked as they walked across the sodden schoolyard. It was no longer raining, but the ground was wet and slippery, and Abby was dreading the long journey home. I don't have a car, she said. We're headed to the train station. Where do you live? We're actually going to visit a friend in St. Kilda. The teacher seemed to hesitate before gesturing to the lone black car in the staff parking bay. I can give you a lift if you'd like. It's not exactly my direction, but I'd feel better knowing you both got there safely. Abby was aware she should say no. It would clearly be an imposition on the poor man, who looked absolutely exhausted. And yet, the thought of a warm car was too good to resist. That would be amazing. So who are you visiting? The teacher asked, once they were settled in. My boyfriend, Abby grinned. He works in finance with me, but he hasn't met Spencer yet. He's the one who doesn't know you have a son? That's right. But he knows you're bringing him there tonight. No, I'm going to surprise him. The teacher didn't bother trying to hide his disapproval. Are you sure it wouldn't be best to simply go home? Abby shook her head, reaching to the seat behind where her little boy was already sleeping and giving him a gentle pat on the leg. No, she insisted, as the thought of Marcus's warm embrace filled her mind. It's about time he met Spencer. I'm doing the right thing. If you say so. The teacher frowned, deep lines visible across his brow. And what was the address? After finding the best route, they began their journey in near silence, Spencer breathing heavily while Abby rested her head against the window, watching the blurry haze of streetlights pass by. It was obvious the teacher didn't approve, but she didn't care. Marcus may have been avoiding her the last few days, but he was probably just nervous about their relationship moving too quickly. Once she turned up on his doorstep, he would be delighted to see her. Of that, she was certain.